Certainly, we could.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Very warm greetings from Council of Architecture. I'm so glad today we have participants from all over the world: Malaysia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, South Africa, US, Mexico, New York, and of course, India. Welcome to this Suez social platform. For everyone who are not from India, just want to let you know that CO is a Council of Architecture. It has been constituted by Government of India under the provision of Architects Act 1972 enacted by Parliament of India. And CO is charged with the responsibility to regulate education and practice in India. And of course, we maintain register of architects. And we started this initiative of serious social dialogue to promote dialogue and discussion about architecture. So, and today's we have our very, very special guest. We have architect Aleksandra from US. She's an architect and she is assistant professor with University of Texas. And I formally welcome you, Aleksandra, to this platform. And from CA Social Platform, we have Professor Durganand Balsavar. And so I request Durganandji, please take this dialogue forward and introduce Aleksandra formally too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sapnaji, for the invitations and introductions. And I have to personally thank the council, the president, Sapnaji, and the entire council members for actively supporting this forum for the last 2 years through some of the most challenging times of the pandemic. And thank you very much for that. So welcome to the 18th edition of the COS Social Reads. There are several parallel forums. This is the Reads Forum that explores the act of reading, writing, research that converses with praxis. So this is a vertical that dialogues with praxis through the act of research. And so we have today Dr. Aleksandra Jaeschke on a very significant theme that she called, or I think sensitively titled, regrounding. And so welcome, Aleksandra. And we look forward, there's a lot of anticipation to your talk. I have received calls from several architects, quite curious how this links to the practice, what kind of transformational role you see for it. So there's quite a lot of anticipation around this talk. And after the talk, there'll be a brief dialogue on this. Let me introduce the speaker for today. Aleksandra is an architect and assistant professor of architecture and sustainable design at the University of Texas at Austin. She was born in Poland and earned a doctoral degree from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and a diploma from the Architectural Association in London. I won't read the rest of the profile. I'd rather give the time to Aleksandra. The profile has been posted on all the council platforms, including the invite by which everyone has come in here. So they will be reading the profile. So I'll go to the theme of the talk, which is regrounding, a significant research in the context of particularly the paradoxes of the Anthropocene era and its relationship to the biosphere and geosphere as we see it. So I invite now Professor Aleksandra Jaeschke to speak about this act of regrounding, which she calls a need for a profound ecological regrounding of the architectural practice and of the way in which we as architects think to confront the environmental crisis, that we must cultivate a new kind of theoretical soil. I'd leave the rest to Aleksandra. Do join us to welcome Aleksandra in this presentation. Thank you, Aleksandra.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak to your audience on this platform that I admire very much. And it's the first time I have a chance to speak to a non-American, non-European audience. And I really look forward to it because I have been increasingly inspired by how you think about architecture in India and in other countries in Asia, Southeast Asia. And I really look forward to this dialogue. Let me share my slides very quickly. And please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, it's visible.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. So regrounding, I hope it becomes clear in a moment. It's really more about thinking than designing, but I've become convinced that we really need to rethink how we think in order to be able to even talk about sustainable or ecological design. Susan Simard's research book, Finding the Mother Tree, is all about connections. Interconnectedness is on everyone's agenda. And the term has, unfortunately, in the recent period turned into almost a platitude, but Simard's work really transcends the usual cliches that we hear around. Simard, she's a Canadian forester and forest ecologist, presents us with scientifically verified observations that prove that interconnectedness is not only real, but also concrete. Her book, an account of nearly 3 decades of research, reveals a universe, a fascinating universe of intra and interspecies cooperation among trees that use subterranean mycorrhizal networks, that is fungal webs, to trade nutrients and what to me constitutes an even more groundbreaking discovery, exchange information. These filamentous fungal structures, collectively known as mycelium, are as physical as the tree branches themselves. Interconnectedness is not something that is esoteric. It's really material, although its purpose, as she tells us, transcends material and energetic exchanges that we tend to focus on. The question that really comes to my mind when I think about it is why we, that is architects, still really struggle to acknowledge the importance of this and many other scientific discoveries. Unfortunately, few of us see the tree when we look at a timber beam. So it should really not be a surprise that those who know what mycelium is, and there are more and more architects looking at it, are mostly excited about its potential as a new material resource. So few will reflect on the fact that while making a biodegradable mycelium brick, an admirable innovation in itself, they are handling the stuff that tree thoughts, we could say, are made of. To me, that's really striking. But Simard's work tells us precisely that. Mycelium is more than a rapidly renewable resource. It's the stuff that allows trees, and of course other plants as well, but that's less understood, to communicate. Theoretical physicist David Bohm once observed in a typical to him unorthodox way that thought is real. Not only human thought, possible thanks to electrochemical impulses fired along neural pathways, is real, but the reality of thoughts can really assume many different forms that we neglect. Botanist and expert in plant intelligence, Stefano Mancuso, who I recently had a pleasure to interview, has explained to me and has demonstrated that intelligence is really not a faculty that requires a centralized neural network like the one that we are equipped with. It's really an ability that each sentient being develops as they ascertain their individuality in the environment. The adopted means they differ. Plant cognition is diffused and has no need for neurons, but the information exchange between the organisms and its environment, no matter how basic, is really universal. It's a universal aspect of life, not just animal life. It's something we really tend to neglect. So Simard pushes it further in her research. Cognition, intelligence, and perhaps thought as well are not an exclusive domain of individual organisms even, be it plants or animals. Cognition is enacted, intelligence is applied, and thoughts exchanged across webs that really transcend independent organisms. They enable inter-organism communication and allow for community bonding. These modes of information exchange are to some degree fractal, nested, and what's important, they really predate human culture. What's surprising to me is that to those brought up on the survival of the fittest mantra, is that these webs really support community cooperation. And the energy that runs through what many colloquially refer to as Wood Wide Web, which is this mycorrhizal networks, is not authoritative or competitive. CIMART demonstrates that it's supportive and nourishing, all qualities that we are after these days. Unlike many human communities dominated by masculine energy, CIMART's forest is a woman. Its feminine energy encourages sharing and generosity. The magnificent agency of this underground diffuse brain does not manifest itself in a spectacular or imposing form. It's distributed, it's unassuming, and most importantly, it's hidden. So these mycorrhizal communication networks occupy a region that is largely ignored by architects. CIMART and other scientists who study these webs make us look underground and force us to question one of the most common architectural symbols, the ground section line. While terrestrial surfaces afford us, to use J.J. Gibson's term, many vital opportunities, of course we walk on them, we rely on them, they're neither fixed barriers, nor do they mark real limits of discrete systems. And seeing them as such constitutes yet another instance of what philosopher Alfred North Whitehead referred to as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So, like so many other imaginary boundaries set by us architects, the ground section line is really an abstraction that should not be confused with the reality of soil, which is really a vital and dynamic transitional zone that is fundamental to life. It supports all life. And just because animals constitute a small fraction of life on Earth, less than 0.5%, including us humans, most cognitive processes actually happen in that thin boundary layer that we architects represent as a black line. Although you will never see it in a botanical conservatory, a space I've been researching extensively in the recent period, it's in the soil that the kingdom of plants supported by the mycelium root entanglement makes most of its vital decisions. So we could say that greenhouse plants live a somewhat lobotomized life. Their cognitive networks are permanently severed by a myriad of man-made boundaries, architecture. Most architects consider buildings as isolated objects, and even when they do consider material and energetic processes, they do it within tightly drawn system boundaries. Not only do they choose to ignore most of the material and energetic connections that are responsible for the actual impact of their creations, but they also refuse to acknowledge that these impacts are not just material or energetic, they really hamper communication and therefore disturb non-human communities. So we might be living in the information age. Most of us have by now have relocated into the virtual space of the World Wide Web. It enables us to be connected right now, but we hardly pay attention to the ways in which information is picked up and acted upon outside of the human infosphere by other forms of life, plants included. And just because most plants don't vocalize, it does not mean that anthropic noise does not affect their capacity to communicate and does not prevent them from forming communities. And it's clearly not just acoustic disturbances that we need to be paying attention to. We create material barriers that emit chemical, magnetic, and visual noises as well. So in light of Simart's research, the impact of anthropic disturbances really can be compared to something ranging from a permanent lobotomy to something that could be compared with a temporary kind of a brain fog. While most of them are not really life-threatening, they are confusing and can be very, very disturbing. So the section line is not something real. Architects' creations are not autonomous. I know these are all negative statements. So how do we start on a more positive, hopeful note? This is a question I've been asking myself a lot in this period since I actually paused practicing and started teaching in the recent years. I think that what we need to reconsider is really the very models on which we base our thinking. In a recent article that I published in Log, and that was entitled The Song of the Banyan Tree, I juxtaposed the quantitative precision of energy-based metabolic models that represent the prevailing attitude towards the environment, and I'll talk about this model more in a moment. I do that using, of course, Howard T. Adams' models as an example, against something much less known, which is Jacob von Uexküll's functional cycle diagram, and his theory of Umwelt that actually focuses on those mechanisms that allow organisms to interact by receiving, interpreting, and imparting messages to basically exchange information. So Uexküll's work provides really an early explanation of how organisms actually generate their environments, not inhabit, generate their environments, and are generated by them in return for a process of reciprocal communication. As a consequence, it also explains how our minds are integrated with the environment through sentience, since we are an animal. I want to spend some time on this argument because it proposes, in my opinion, an important shift and perhaps a way to reground architectural discourse in a new theoretical soil, and perhaps a soil that could, that is nourished by a very different, a kind of alternative kind of science from what we have been really paying attention to. This diagram illustrates the functions of a tree according to this brilliant systems ecologist, Howard T. Adams. So using graphic symbols, it basically depicts sources of energy, nutrients, and water in rocks, rain, sun, and wind. It really dismembers the tree by function into leaves, stems, roots, and even mycorrhizal fungi and nodules. Diverging and converging lines of interactions mark material and energetic fluxes that recompose this kind of kit of parts back into a fully functional apparatus. I think of a transistor radio ready to be reverse engineered by a curious child and put back together, more like one of those Jean Tinguely's machines than a real tree, not a tree that I would know how to interact with. And to my untrained eye, of course, I'm not an ecologist, I really see some boxes and arrows that are missing. I struggle to decipher how the diagram tree would actually interact with other species. I see consumers isolated in a circle, but no flowers, nuts, or fruit to attract them, to communicate to them. The arrow of tree consumer interactions shoots out of the system and into the empty margins. So Adams' contribution to the field of systems ecology really consisted in the development of this way of analyzing and representing of the metabolic processes in ecosystems in terms of material and energetic flows, which is what we've been focusing on as architects concerned with sustainability. Adam developed this graphic code to represent the parts and interactions in systems. And his work identify types of processes, flows, interactions of flows, switching actions and amplifications. They're all carriers of exchangeable currencies that we can define. Yet there's no box for me, an active observer, unless that is I consume. Adams' models were also, and that's important, used to simulate the flow of money, projecting the framework into the realm of currencies and real exchange of goods. It really contributed to tools and inspired disciplines such as, of course, theoretical ecology, but also economics and urban planning. We see very similar diagrams used in urban metabolism. After all, a tree, as described by Autumn, is really it appears as a useful service. That is, if you can control it and predict the dynamics of unstable sources and impulsive consumers. And yet, living systems such as this transitional landscape and ecotone between a grassland and a rainforest, just an example, living systems are open systems that depend on their surroundings. They both resist and generate entropy by continuously exchanging matter and energy with their environment. Rather than simply maintaining a priori order, systems evolve toward higher, often unstable levels of organizations. The boundaries between organisms and their environments are hazy. They are indefinite regions. They cannot be neatly arranged in separate boxes. Interactions between parts and processes follow multiple paths that together trigger really complex network effects. And those are unpredictable and often appear counterintuitive. So in the quest to achieve a dynamic equilibrium, this kind of systems pass through various states of stability, and their equilibrium is not a state, but a series of states that actually follow a trajectory, not a line that can be drawn a priori, but one that co-emerges with the system. That's why it's so hard to predict them. And flexibility and capacity to self-correct are fundamental characteristics here. The behavior of a complex system is also unpredictable because apparently insignificant events will trigger highly complex consequences. So for example, the impact of a slight change in the wind direction on the fate of the volatile chemicals emitted by a tree to communicate, to attract a pollinator, as an example, will affect the future of the tree population. Yet Autumn's clockwork kind of tree model does not even acknowledge its presence. So I want to tell you a story that helped me think through these issues for a moment. In the early spring of 2020, just before the COVID lockdown, while I was for my wheelwright research, I spent many days in an old botanical conservatory. This one actually is in my hometown in Poland. A promise of a perfectly sealed world was set out and modeled right in front of me. Yet the underlying feeling that I had while sitting there was that of the calm before a storm, an eerie silence. But there was something else contributing to it that I struggled to name. And I only later realized that it was the thick silence, lack of communication that I could perceive. Stillness and silence, relaxing as they were, they brought a feeling of apprehension. I just couldn't tell why. The storm obviously would never come. I was enclosed in a greenhouse. Yet as I recall it now, I realized that the stillness represented an excess of human control. And really, while the flora proliferated lavishly, there were no consumers, no animals to make noise that I could actually perceive. Packed with plants, the greenhouse really felt empty. There was an almost complete lack of vocalization. Animals, of course, are hard to control, as is complexity. It really was only after I started to read The Great Animal Orchestra by Bernie Krause that I realized that I had paid no attention to the visited soundscapes. No ecological model, such as the model that I've just shared with you, mentions it. No one talks about it. And yet my apprehension was undeniably triggered by the silence. But why does the silence matter if conservatories are plant collections and plants don't utter themselves if not pressed by rain or wind? In fact, it mattered very little when individual plant specimens were planted in pots and arrayed uniquely according to their morphology, as in this image in the conservatory in Palermo in Sicily. It was only later in what constitutes a real ecological revolution that we owe to Alexander von Humboldt that plants started to be classified and arranged according to their geography. And of course, here individual specimens represented regional floras that adapted to similar geographic conditions that are key in the case, of course, of plants of economic importance. But we see that in this image where you see a specific type of a landscape kind of replicated. And if these plants could vocalize, it would really be a jarring cacophony, because while driven by spatial distribution, the arrangement paid no attention to community dynamics or interspecies relationships. They just came from a similar geographic location. Maybe with time, they would be able to kind of create a decent jazz improvisation, but not really a dialogue. Surely not a harmonious chorus indicating that we've just built a self-sustaining living system that could one day thrive away from Earth, which is what many of us is inspired towards when they experiment with this enclosed systems. Not a song for sure that could evolve and go on forever, as it has been going on forever, thanks to evolution in the open. So even if plants cannot vocalize in ways audible to the human ear, scientists now believe that they are actually capable of perceiving sound waves and detect water, distinguish between wind and, for example, chewing insects, etc., etc. But also against common beliefs that some of them are emitting sounds emitting sounds in particular stressful situations, such as, for example, drought, and those can be picked up. So plants obviously and unintentionally also co-generate many familiar sounds. Raindrops falling on leaves, a branch snapping under the weight of a predator are all sonic cues picked up by vocalizing animals with which plants are entangled in complex relationships. So the complexity and completeness of these assemblages really resonates in various soundscapes. And as Krause and also other researchers, as David Monacchi, an Italian ecoacoustic researcher, as they demonstrate in their field recordings, these choruses are indicators of undisturbed and unconfined biodiversity and the richness of ecological relationships built over long spans of time. As the multimodal nature of plant communication becomes more and more evident, plants use electromagnetic, chemical, visual, and acoustic signaling. The definition of the ecological niche must also be really expanded. And the presence of noise, let's say human-made noise, not only affects an organism's capacity to interact with its habitat and community, but it really also prevents it often from performing basic vital functions, which means fulfilling its niche. So Krause's niche hypothesis illustrates this beautifully. Each organism occupies a specific spectrum of sound frequencies and temporal durations expressed graphically in his spectrograms, which allows it to communicate without being actually canceled out by another vocalizing animal, except unfortunately when it's us with our jarring noise. This new auditory dimension of the ecological niche also suggests a novel way to redefine the boundaries of a tree's vital territory, one that manifests itself in a unique biophony and audibly expresses the richness of its extended community. None of these interactions, of course, however, appear in Adam's model. None of them can be enclosed under glass. So some time ago, I became really fascinated with this glorious plant that you will know better than I do because it comes from the part of the world in which most of you are actually living. It's the Banyan Fig Tree. And I became really fascinated with its intricate web of life as a model to think about these issues. So I searched for and found this tree in my small old conservatory that I was visiting. And when I was standing in front of it and thought that it just lacked glory, but I couldn't really tell why. It was small, but Adam's model would have assessed it as kind of healthy. It was performing all its basic vital functions, but I only now hear its silence as I consider every relationship of which that particular specimen enclosed in a greenhouse was actually deprived. So the banyan is not a normal tree. Its growth strategies evolve over the tree's lifetime. And I tell this story in a shorter way here but I really think it's important to kind of reflect on it, to be able to appreciate the richness of its life that we often forget about. So its growth strategies evolve over the tree's lifetime as it expands across physical space. It's imposing in appearance, of course, but the banyan tree depends on communication and relations with a myriad of other organisms. It begins its life as an epiphyte and develops from a seed dropped by birds and bats and trapped in a crevice of a branch of another tropical tree. The growth accelerates once the epiphyte comes in contact with the soil to develop roots. Eventually, of course, it will achieve this splendid arborescent form with the hollow trunk of the previous tree and rooted in the ground, and with the branches forming a flat crown. This process of becoming tree can take 100 years. As the branches continue to extend far away from the trunk, the banyan adopts a new strategy. It actually forms those magnificent prop roots that shoot toward the ground, and once they hit the floor, the forest floor, they eventually thicken and melt together to form the supporting stilts. And the tree then starts to gradually expand across its territory, supported by these multiple trunks. As you will know better than me, the Great Banyan near Kolkata, for example, is 300 years old and continues to grow without the original trunk, occupying nearly 200,000 square feet of land. Now, Autumn's model says nothing about patterns of distribution in space, but it would take more than one biosphere 2 in Arizona to enclose the secret tree of Kolkata. In the tightly knit web of the tropical forest in the open, expansion is just one of many creative forms of mobility that allow the fig tree to thrive in its environment. As it grows, the banyan establishes connections with other organisms, forming living assemblages that transcend its own physicality. These interactions with other species, be it plants, fungi, or animals, those Autumn's consumers, they range across the entire spectrum of possibilities. The banyan engages with other trees in commensal and then symbiotic relationships that are quasi-parasitic. Its relationship with fungi, termites, and insects are all more or less symbiotic, though. It partners with wasps to transport the pollen and with birds, bats, and monkeys to disperse the seeds. Caterpillars feed on its leaves, but beetle larvae on its wood, fibers are consumed by termites, and other insects take care of dead leaves, while fungi provide protection. Quite a chorus if you were to allow it all into the greenhouse or into the model of the functions of a tree. The relationship, what's really fascinating between the banyan and its wasp, constitutes one of the key connections in this web and a prime example of co-evolution. The giant literally depends on a tiny insect for the survival of its species, and very often just one species of a wasp. Guided by the volatile chemicals, that is communication, emitted by the banyans, ready for pollination, female wasps travel long distances to lay eggs and pollinate. By long, I really mean miles. Few of these wasps, 1 in hundreds maybe, will find the right banyan tree. A successful female enters the syconium, that is the fruit, through a small opening at the apex of this fruit. And once inside, the female will lay her eggs in some of the flowers and, of course, simultaneously shake off the pollen, and some of the flowers will develop a seed. And the female wasp will die inside. And once hatched, the male wasp will pass very brief life enclosed inside the syconium, the only world that they will actually know, a world within a world. So those wingless and blind male wasps, they will mate, and in some cases, sorry, not male wasps in general, they will mate and in some cases help the young female to exit the fig intact with her wings and now coated with pollen to embark on the next once-in-a-lifetime flight. Shortly after that, the fruit ripens and its color and odor communicates, attracts frugivores who will then unintentionally help disperse the seeds by excreting them. Only particular colors and specific spectrum of scents emitted by the ripe fig fruit, now vacated by the female wasps and carrying seeds ready for dispersal, will attract those birds and other frugivores. Their songs probably act as acoustic cues, attracting other birds to participate in the feast. How many of this can ever happen under glass? Most likely none. Multiple growth strategies, modes of expansion in space and propagation over time, as well as methods of signaling and communication, contribute to the complexity of this glorious tree. The stability of this living multiplicity is only a matter of perception based on the choice of a spatial temporal scale of reference. The boundaries of the Banyan's universe can be traced only as a function of decreasing intensities of interactions, not black lines. Surely, not by measuring the extension of its spreading branches that will eventually and inevitably run into an impenetrable glass wall of ours, that is human greenhouses, and shoot far beyond any model margins. The definition of the Banyan niche is open and unstable. Understanding the many dimensions that define the vital diagram of the tree, of any tree for that matter, and the many loops that make up its web of life is the first step to deciding how and if to enclose life, a tree, if you want it to survive, thrive, and sustain you. To know it, I found out that it's sometimes enough to listen. The smaller you enclose biosphere, the more efficient the services you will have to provide to substitute for the generosity and redundancy that underlie the barter economy of nature. This is the support of the small conservatory that I visited in Poland, underground, like the mycelium network. Adam's models surely can help you simulate the chopped up services, but in reality, the niche must be considered in relation to other interconnected niches. The habitat expands into the habitats of other organisms, which in turn constitute habitats in which other species realize their own niche. One can try to model it as a network, but really it's a field of fluctuating intensities and boundaries. Initially defined as a set of properties of the external environment, a kind of latent potential to be fulfilled by species, like imagine an empty box, the niche gradually started to be seen as a unique set of attributes of the species, a diagram of properties describing patterns of resource use and interactions with the external environment. So picture more the lines diverging and converging to a box. Understood as an essential part of the biocybernetic impetus of nature, this way of thinking about the niche resonates really powerfully with what I mentioned before, the Uxelian idea of the n-dimensional Umwelt, according to which individual organisms and species actually perceive and act upon unique worlds, their own worlds, without necessarily finalizing a material or energetic transaction. From an Uxelian perspective, we do not inhabit worlds or fill in spatial niches. We, that is various species, including Homo sapiens, we generate them and they generate us through a process of reciprocal communication and exchange of information, perception and interpretation of signs and production of effects. Unlike Adam's model, Yüksel's functional cycle diagram and his theory of Umwelt focus on those mechanisms that allow organisms to interact and form living assemblages through the act of communication by sensing and emitting information, receiving, interpreting, and imparting messages, really affecting circuits of cues and responses. This is, to my mind, as important as the material and energetic models. So open organic systems continuously emit and harvest information, like this bird, from the environments to develop and maintain established orders. These flows of information could potentially be embedded in Adam's diagrams, where he, of course, to expand the focus of his inquiry beyond the transfer of matter and energy. After all, information not only gained currency in the post-war research, it became the currency of the modern world. And yet, unlike in human efficiency-driven engineering, organic systems often rely on a lot of informational redundancy. If a bird song, for example, is canceled out by environmental noise, human-made noise, but not only, its repetition will ensure that the message is actually eventually heard, even if it takes more time and more bits that we're so precious about. Redundancy offers an efficient way to deliver messages across environments, prone to signaling, competition, and background noise, of course. Redundancy, acoustically expressed as repetition, enriches natural biophonies. It's also evident based on many reports from the field that not all perception reaction cycles are driven by a material or energetic exchange that would be explainable or explained, that could be explained by one of atoms' interaction lines. They often appear irrational and simply playful, disengaged from the model behavior. Even when functional, but not directed at a particular subject, they are picked up as sensorial affects. They affect us regardless of our participation. So this Euclidean framework that I've been talking about, even if it's largely ignored outside of the narrow field of behavioral studies and biosemiotics, is an old key to a new way of thinking about the environment. I believe that we must no longer exclusively rely on systems ecology models as a tool for ecological thought. Adam's models address material and energetic flows and have been heavily instrumentalized to manage natural systems from which we extract, of course, resources. In fact, our economy thrives on them. Unfortunately, their success is in part the reason we are in such a deep ecological crisis. These models can still tell us how to design a synthetic biological system, for example, a self-sufficient microcosm under glass, but they will not explain how or why we, animals, humans, birds, are affected by the smell of a ripe fig or the sparkling colors of the Banyan universe. Culturally, we need to focus elsewhere. And I think Yücsel's understanding of the mechanisms responsible for the union of the subject and its world, its Umwelt, creates a powerful image of the synthesis in nature, synthesis of which we are part. Each aspect of the organism is the synthesis of the cues provided by the environment and the receptive mechanisms that are embedded in the organisms. Only such an unbreakable union can create such phenomena as vision or olfaction. A smell is an instance of synthesis between the chemical substance emitted by the environment and the sensing devices embedded in the organism. The organism on itself is not going to experience anything. Neither one nor the other can give a full account for olfaction in isolation. Isolation is deaf. Eyes, ears, and noses are not capable of generating these phenomena in isolation. They are devices that are functionally bound to their territories as much as these territories come into existence thanks to them. So an immense opportunity, I think, for regrounding, for a new model of ecological relations emerging from here for me. A model based on communication that goes beyond the quantitative exchange of information that can be captured and kind of converted into economic power. And this model is really pre-linguistic and carries the capacity to launch us back into the open field of other non-verbal species. I think more than a model, it's really a protocol for probing into environments as they unfold rather than fitting into pre-established model structures. In that very instance between a signal and its perception, Yücsel's functional cycle model opens up a fissure for poetry, a space from which to shift our cultural trajectory to another channel. The landscape is, I think, there. It's awaiting us. In this field, there are no arrows piercing into boxes, no strange strangers, eternally facing each other across an abyss. There are signal exchanges within one common field of affection. This is not a call, and I emphasize that this is not a call to abandon the material world. It's a call to subtract it from the very material mechanisms. It's a call to subtract those very material mechanisms from the economy and let them be deeply affected by the other being, regardless of its level of articulation. So just to wrap up and go back to Simard's work, what's amazing about her discoveries is that it further confirms that minds, various minds, and cognition in general are really distributed and integrated with the environment, and at times in very intangible but fundamental ways related to communication. And recent scientific discoveries really demonstrate that there are various forms of brain linkages. So it's not just the brain with the environment, it's different brains that also link, like, for example, performing birds. So while clearly not interconnected by web of mycelium, they are too, those brains are embodied in the environment and continuously transformed by the environment and by other minds. Gregory Bateson described it in the following way. You decide that you want to get rid of the byproducts of human life, and that Lake Erie will be a good place to put them. You forget that the ecomental system called Lake Erie is a part of your wider ecomental system, and that the lake is driven, if the lake is driven insane, its insanity is incorporated in the larger system of your thought and experience. End of quote. How can we pretend to stay thoughtful if losing the environment most likely means losing our minds as well? Perhaps we need to learn how to defy what physicist David Bohm called the state of self-sustaining confusion, a state that arises when the mind is trying to escape the real awareness of conflict. End of quote. We must learn how to achieve what his favorite conversation companion and renowned spiritual teacher Krishnamurti called, and I quote, passion, the intensity of complete attention. It may really help us rethink what it means to be creative as well if we try to engage in similar conversations. In the essay titled On Creativity, David Bohm sees the creative development of science dependent on the perception of the irrelevance of an already known set of fundamental differences and similarities, a certain model. The prevailing state of self-sustaining confusion deprives most of us of this capacity to observe, to see. In fact, as Bohm explains, it's the hardest step of all, but once it has taken place, it frees the mind to be attentive, alert, aware, and sensitive, and it can discover a new order and thus create new structures of ideas and concepts, end of quote. It allows the mind to be creative. Creativity was also at the center of Whitehead's understanding of reality. He basically thought that production of novelty was a fundamental aspect of nature, not something that is exclusive to us humans. Creativity was a universal of universals that characterizes matter of fact. Creativity is, as he says, how many becomes one. So considering this fact, Simart's forest is not only intelligent or thoughtful, we could say, it's creative. And when we interrupt its creativity. To capture the song of unedited reality, to perceive its true pattern and respond to it in a harmonious way through design, we must first learn how to practice attention, not pay attention to anything in particular, but be nonverbal sensitivity. This is perhaps a prerequisite of true creativity, the first step towards this regrounding in design, architecture, and in life. And perhaps instead of a post-human turn, we simply need more creative humans capable of complete attention towards the extended or distributed self that we can perhaps again call our nature. This might be the first step to the process of regrounding of architecture as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I'm sorry, I took probably a couple of minutes more than 40 minutes.
No, I think that's fine. So thank you for that, for those fascinating insights on regrounding and its translation into research and writing. I have received several responses, questions, and I think as we go along, I've kind of framed it in 3 specific modes. And as we go along, and if I get any more, I would kind of add it into these 3 modes, So if we were for a moment, and I think if I can just paraphrase it for the Indian context, the discussion has been one that links to the larger ecological context. with a hint on how it may shape or re-influence the manner in which architects today understand the act of construction. If I can just rephrase it for the schools of architecture here, because what tends to happen is that there have been over the years, and I think more so after the Industrial Revolution, when we moved into more rigorous or aggressive forms of extraction, with the concrete coming in, with steel coming in, glass coming in, the whole act of architecture in some way got distanced from its relationship to nature. And the more with the act of drawing in an architect's office, now the computer-aided systems seem to be distancing the architect from nature even more. So this term of, is somebody nature literate or plant literate, where an architect knows the trees, or a first year student knows the life cycle of trees or what plants exist even in the campus, stand open to inquiry. So I'm just grounding the kind of question before we begin, because your theme on regrounding went in great depth into this whole understanding of what a relationship of a biosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere may mean to us, and the fact that we are so obsessed with the object and the construction of the object that we seem to, as human beings, already constantly place ourselves outside of nature. We psychologically seem to feel, so we say man in nature, human in nature, but when we were merely extensions of that very nature, and we place ourselves in juxtaposition with nature, I think we've actually falsely segregated ourselves as a species outside of nature. And I think researches of this kind become provocative and essential in bringing back that humaneness or the humility with which man sees, or humans see themselves, as an extension of this much larger, complex biosphere or ecology that we probably have not grappled or completely confronted. So let me now phrase it. So would you, if I were to now take it to the slightly outside the boundaries of what you presented, more for the benefit of the students and schools of architecture who are there. And if we were to say, I think in the early days, there was Vladimir Vernadsky, one of your references, who talked of biosphere. Then there's Barry Commoner, who has very radically said that we need to look at circular systems very long back. And I think today it's become, as you said, quite a platform to talk about circular systems, recycling, without necessarily having to go beyond the veneer of what it means, And I think when we look at these kind of interspecies or the community dynamics that we're discussing, or the assemblages, you have James Loveck talking about the notion of Gaia, where he doesn't segregate plant from even rock, or otherwise we think rock and minerals is inert, plant is still alive in some way, and human beings are, of course, ordained from the heavens. So we're a different, we can do almost what we like. And that's the kind of bias that we carry. What would, in just briefly, what would your suggestion be of how schools of architecture need to rethink this interconnectedness? I'm just kind of raising it because we have many schools who've logged in. The council is also here. What would it mean, in just a few pointers? I know you've given one pointer of the embodied immersion and observation. That itself kind of evokes evokes an understanding beyond the verbal. Yeah, we are using words,
Yeah.
but what we perceive may be beyond these words. So
Yeah.
that's one part. How else would you see are there examples of projects happening across the world, a few examples where they're trying to break this boundary?
Since you're framing it within the issue of education, my immediate reaction is that I really believe that we need to rethink what we actually teach students as foundational knowledge. So perhaps what I was saying now, it has nothing to do yet with how differently we should be thinking about approaching a project, a design project, but how differently we should approach the project of educating architects. And I know it's really hard because we're all very impatient and we want to know how to design. And that's what my students most of the time, come with, that the excitement, basically. Of course, we are architects, we want to design. But I think what we're realizing is that in a school of architecture, that very often, especially, and I know the American context, but also my own education, even at the Architectural Association, there's so much to learn that is disciplinary knowledge that we end up not exposing students to the foundational knowledge that comes from other disciplines. So what I've been doing is really consciously stepping away from transmitting the disciplinary knowledge that I know that the architects will anyway acquire because it's everywhere, and trying to bring my colleagues' attention, first of all, but also my own students' attention to those foundational fields that can help us understand basically how we should be thinking about the environment before we make the first line. So I really was transformed by taking a course by a famous ecologist, Richard T.T. Foreman at Harvard Graduate School of Design. When I returned to school to do my PhD, I think architects should have a basic introduction to ecology, but I also believe that we have gradually transformed philosophical thinking into architectural theory that is immediately very confined to disciplinary boundaries and self-referential. I think that needs to be reopened again with the clear aim of helping architects to think. Philosophy is a way it's our science of thinking, right? Like the way we think, the way we think about problems, that's where philosophy comes in and can help us to rethink our relationships. So I really believe that we need to make space for those kind of disciplines at the very beginning of education, because I notice with students that I teach that those things slowly sink in and they affect how they then think about the design, the professional decisions that they will be making. They no longer feel comfortable, ethically comfortable to make certain decisions, but they do come to school with no prior knowledge of those things, and we cannot hold it against them. We need to recognize the fact that many schools across the world, and I mean high schools, do not teach students philosophy, do not teach them about the environment, focus on sciences, that precise sciences that help us develop technology. Those are not tools that we can continue basing our field on, because it's obvious if we even look at the development of the ecological thought and how that was absorbed into architecture, is that we keep on asking the same questions. The last 150, you look 100 years back, 50 years, 25 years, 5 years, and you realize that we're going kind of in circles. So the questions seem to be just perhaps structured in a wrong way, and they're rooted in wrong philosophical and scientific discourses. I think that's where I am now. I'm being very honest. And I am trying to be part of an open conversation that tries to rethink those very foundational tools, thinking tools that we should be providing to architects.
Sorry. Thank you very much, because I think since this is directed more at students and young architects, I thought it may be a opportune moment to kind of dialogue it with the kind of, so we are looking at, if I may quickly paraphrase, we're looking at a time when the 1930s architectural education looked at form, looked at proportion, looked at texture, looked at the way in which forms come together, or even structures like concrete and mechanical systems. But somewhere the attention to an embodied experience of environment and nature was probably not given as much attention, at best in some kind of subject called landscape architecture, but again, which was largely a curated kind of, I won't call it artificial, but close to artificial. There was a kind of conjuring of landscapes rather than an immersive understanding of these unpredictabilities of nature, you know. So from there, if I may come to the second provocation, and that's something which you had raised in a very, it may get a little radical, but it's on one hand, can ideas which have been incubated in what you called the silence of the greenhouse, the human greenhouse, and these are ideas that are incubated under isolated laboratory conditions. And these experiments, we hope, would inform us about a real world outside, which is really so unpredictable, multi-species. The range of communications are much more complex than the contained greenhouse. Do you see a parallel, and this is a little provocative, do you see a parallel in which architectural education itself is happening in a greenhouse versus these kind of greenhouses which are attempting to understand the ecology? I know it's a little provocative, so you may or may not respond to it, but I couldn't hold myself back from asking that question, since you talked about the utter silence of that greenhouse, and that banyan tree. And so it was for me a very different experience, because in India we're living with you're living with a certain closer connection to nature, of course. Climatically, we are fortunate to have that, but those images kind of provoked deeper clinical distance. And then I just wondered, is that same process, because we are borrowing philosophies, we are borrowing a lot of our architectural philosophy from linguistics, and so whether it was deconstruction or whether it was we borrow it to kind of give it a sense of legitimacy to architecture. And if I were to juxtapose that with what you were discussing of immersing in the real world now and leaving all those theories, I'm not saying aside, but placing them where they needed to be placed, how would you characterize that? Is it possible to simulate, or you think it's not possible to simulate, or what would your position be?
I smiled when you said that, it's a provocation, that the idea of discussing the greenhouse goes way beyond the actual greenhouse and its relationship to the environment. It's really a metaphor as well for the way in which we isolate our disciplinary thinking. So I absolutely agree with you, and I thank you for mentioning it. I went out and started traveling, thinking about greenhouses as this way in which we are relating to the environment or isolating ourselves from the environment. But clearly, it became for me a way to think about our way of isolating certain discourses from other discourses and creating this isolated environments, in environments, I mean, for example, architectural environments, that then promote a certain type of artificial, disconnected way of thinking about our disciplinary problems without actually considering larger non-disciplinary issues that happen, and that basically mean that there is no such thing as a self-referential architecture that can just thrive on its own, right? And the same goes for the discourse of the soil and talking about the underground, and of course that is also the theoretical soil that we need to be rethinking. It's not just the fact that we desperately need to be caring for soil because that's where the plants grow, and if we destroy urban soil there will be no plants, but of course the discourse goes beyond that. So for example, in my previous research that I'm now, it's soon going to be a book, that was my doctoral research, where I actually looked at how the way sustainability is defined in building regulations, how that has been affected by everything but architects, by economy, by financial incentives, by policy, by all sorts of different interests. And I really try to break the glass barriers of our discipline when we think about sustainability, when we think that it's in our hands within a certain confined sphere where we define what sustainability is and we define the boundaries of the systems that we consider, to really make my students and architects remember that those boundaries are imaginary, that really we are the ones who create them to kind of protect ourselves and to enjoy the discourse, which of course is fundamental. We're cultural animals. I'm not against architectural culture. I love architecture. I love how, the linguistic aspect of architecture, formal aspect of architecture, shapes us and shapes our sensibilities, but it's just not enough in the situation in which we are environmentally, in relation to climate change, but all sorts of things that are going on in the world, of course. So I really thank you for just expressing it so clearly. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it was, I think I would resonate with what you're saying. I don't think I meant that we set it aside, because I think architecture is a culture, and what we've derived from these other interdisciplinary relationships, with linguistics, and of course has enriched our very act of knowing how we live on earth. And I think it has enriched the consciousness. It's about, do we bring back a layer which we have forgotten probably? Or do we bring back a layer which we as a human race never kind of figured it out? There are many authors who discuss the fact that a spider or any other species probably understands architecture better than the human race, because they've been at constructing the habitats for 1,000,000 years.
Yeah.
While as the human race is maybe 70,000 or 100,000 years. So we carry so much of self-doubt in the act of building our own habitat, which probably another species does not, and it's because it became intellectual. It's a young field. So human beings are still kind of grappling and struggling with the idea of that habitat when it gets layered with so many other aspirations and so many other desires. So coming to that, are we saying then that given the climate emergency, and I'm sure there are both sides of the coin that believe that the climate emergency, but we are very sure today that it is the Anthropocene act or human activity itself accelerating climate emergency. Yeah. And does it mean there is a very deep need, and more so on the part of architects through the agency of the schools of architecture, to cultivate what we may call an ecological cognition, to kind of begin to observe and understand ecological processes, which means that it has to be a more comprehensive understanding of the regenerative capacities or the liminal capacities of the different constituents of nature. It could be as simple as the relationship of water and land, or what a wasteland does, or what the relationship at the coast between the sea and the coastline,
Land, yeah.
the plant and the land. And so is that the kind of regrounding that you are alluding to, in the fact that this, so could you venture right now, very briefly, on what could be the few steps that schools of architecture in the next few years need to absorb to awaken? It's already awakened at one level, but to awaken this deeper sense of planetary ecological cognition, that we definitely value the lessons of history, its institutions, its paradox, its contradictions, its cultural heritage. But what do you see in this regrounding in terms of a planetary ecological cognition that schools of architecture could say in the next few years we need to imbibe in students who would become architects in the next maybe 3 years, 4 years? Could you just enumerate a few of them?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to talk about it because, of course, there's such an urgency that we always will say we have not enough time to transform people's minds, right? That takes time. So we will always run against this criticism. But at the same time, I think, again, and I know I'm repeating myself, if we look backwards, we realize that we've been saying, and I'm mainly talking from the Western point of view, we've been saying, we need to focus on the material and energetic models to optimize the way we use resources. And we've been doing that with more and more precision and teaching students how to use softwares to calculate, carbon efficiency and energy efficiency. But if we are honest with ourselves and we look at the results of what we've been teaching students, it's obvious that we have not really succeeded to change the trend. And I think that, unfortunately, what we have to do is not only continue exposing them and teaching them how to understand the material and energetic processes within very open boundaries that are planetary boundaries that allow them to appreciate the impact of extraction, rather than thinking about, the narrow-minded optimization of facades or things like that. But next to that, we really need to be changing the way architects think. And to me, that is exposing them to science of ecology, but also to specific philosophers. So, I refer to Whitehead. I've been reading more and more Spinoza. Those are those philosophers that have perhaps in the past influenced architects, mainly through Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, but they were absorbed in ways that became formal. And I think that that's what we need to avoid. And I'm talking really from my firsthand experience, because when I was a student at the Architectural Association, this was the time, early 2000 until 2005 was a fantastic time of incredible research. But when I reflect on that, a lot of the reading and reflecting on those philosophers through the work of Deleuze and related thinkers translated back into formal exercises. So, right, a lot of thinking about evolution transformed into thinking about algorithms that allow us to generate form. And I think that as much as this was fascinating, and I've learned a lot as a student, it really gave me incredible tools. I think it's really our obligation, ethical obligation, to stop doing that, because this just keeps on enclosing us in that, theoretical, intellectual greenhouse. We need to be reading these philosophers, in order to understand and accept the complexity of the world and its openness, and unfortunately face it, because it's hard. It's very hard for architects. But I do believe that if we do that, we will make very different decisions. And I do also believe that, especially, if you look at the proportion of buildings in the United States that are actually built by architects, especially in residential architecture, that I know that the statistics more, not many buildings are actually built by architects. But they are built by developers, by engineers, by people who just know how to build. So I see a tremendous potential for architects to redirect their, efforts towards thinking about design as a way of guiding people to make better decisions. And I know that it's hard for young architects to accept that, because they are in love with form. They want to work with form. But I also think that more and more young people that I work with, they are also tired of that. And I really admire those who decide to study these things, not to channel it back into formal exercises, but really to keep on telling whoever has power, whoever makes decisions, that their thinking is too contrived and too bounded. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I really think that it's very basic education, and asking students to question the questions that we're asking. It's not about how much less energy we can use for a building that we don't even know why we're building. So many buildings we built with no actual vital reason, right? It's all speculation. So I think there are just so many questions that need to be asked and put on the table with courage in schools of architecture. And I think it also requires an engagement from the architectural offices that eventually employ students, because this is a bit of a vicious circle as well, where we need to train students in a way that will make them good employees. And that leaves us with very little time for actually making them good human beings and ethically correct participants in communities. Yeah,
I think yes. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for that provocation, and it was much in line with what we were looking for. Because if I can again, the fact that yes, there is a challenge there, that at times to develop the discipline itself in the 5 years, or to develop the professional requirements of an architect in those 5 years is a challenge unto itself. But I think more so, as you suggested, if we are in a phase of, and we accept it, that we are in a phase of a certain climate emergency, but not need to panic on it or generate fear or become doomsday prophets, not of that kind, but more to, I think, sit back with a certain balance and reassess what these relationships are about: inhabitation, the act of building, and the environment, which needs to then inform architectural education and the practice. It was in that light, when I joined, when I was part of that conference we were organizing, I realized that this conversation in a more intense way is necessary. It does happen, but it happens in a manner as if it's an addition to something that was already happening. But now we are discussing it as something so fundamental that it calls for a rethink of the role and relevance of the architectural discipline itself. That it cannot anymore have blinkers on the larger environmental processes, but needs to engage in it beyond the confines of a plot, within which one builds a sustainable building, and
I think like one thing if I can add that comes to my mind while you're talking about it is that I've been focusing on plants. It's a passion of mine in this period, but I have been thinking about other aspects as well, and I realize very often that we the science on which we base our decisions, often we don't understand it when it comes to energy, right? There are so many preconceptions and misconceptions about actually the science of energy in our field that when you talk to specialists, and like I am very lucky to have as our dean Michelle Addington, who is an expert in energy, and she talks about it, or people like Kilmoa, and you realize that we really need to re-educate ourselves in many fields of science that are fundamental to our discipline, such as energy, materials, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean just looking at communication, which is what I'm talking about today. For me, this is fundamental because it is what connects us in unbreakable ways to the environment and makes us feel like when we harm it, we harm ourselves. But that's more of a position of a meditator, right? Of a spiritual kind of position. But I think we equally really need to question standards that are much closer to architecture, like materials, energy. Our standards, like the standards we use for certain in sustainable guidelines, often are wrong because we do not understand the science that is behind them. We don't question them. And also we do not understand the science and mechanisms behind softwares, simulation softwares. That's another challenge that architects could take on. Question the tools that you're using, right? Don't just say, I simulated the energy with this and that tool, so it's correct. No, there is just really a lot to keep on questioning. And that's probably at a higher level, maybe of researchers doing, masters and PhD programs, projects. But that would be regrounding in a correct science, or at least the most recent science and most honest science that we have.
Thank you, Aleksandra, for that dialogue. So I won't really, while we end this particular dialogue, I really see it as a beginning of several more dialogues or conversations. And I hope with the council and in India, we can also at some point put the pandemic behind us and meet in real time rather than this virtual format.
Yeah.
But I think this was more for a provocation on reflecting on the relationship of the architectural practice with the kind of consciousness and complexity of the nature around us. It's no more inert. It's an active kind of a collaboration and participation with nature around us. And I think it opens a very fundamental question on what would the kind of architecture be, or what's the kind of architecture that would evolve with this kind of a broader embodied experience of a collaborative environmental practice, if one may call it. So thank you very much again. If you would like to sum it up for viewers in India and Southeast Asia, we would be very honored if you could sum it up, and then we could close for the evening. Thank you.
Okay. Summing it up is hard, but first of all, what I wanted to say is that I really appreciate that you've opened this platform to this conversation. I think this is really an incredibly important thing to have as many people involved and as many organizations that have such incredible following to engage in this conversation. So I wanted to thank you for that. The second thing I wanted to say is if there's anyone in the audience that is interested in this conversation and would like to engage in a direct conversation, I'm really open and always really, really enjoy getting emails and establishing relationships that perhaps can allow us to create collaborations, across borders between different countries and students, because I think that what we really need is also different mentalities of different students from different cultures coming together and confronting their values. And I do believe that, you know, some of the Western values really need to be confronted by values coming from the East, which I admire and respect very, very strongly. So I'm very open to any kind of exchange. Yes, and just to kind of, in 2 words, to summarize, I do believe that we need to be attentively looking into science and philosophy and spiritual knowledge as well, in order to reground the way in which we think about design before we actually talk about design, because we talk about design all the time. And I think it's valid and fair to dedicate a little bit of time to asking ourselves how to ask better questions. So I do not have answers today as to how to better design. And that's not what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to provoke this larger opening. And I want students to be courageous, and I want students to be demanding. You should be demanding for education that is that responds to the emergencies and the needs of the world today. That's my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let's be in touch. And the links have the links for have been placed even on our websites. They could get in touch with you, and including
Fantastic.
So I hope participants take this opportunity and write to Professor Aleksandra. And I know quite a few were deeply interested in the theme, and so I look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you very much. And I have to
I too, and thank you so much again for the invitation, and thanks the council for having me. And I really do hope to be able to visit India very soon and do some of my research there. So I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.